some questions to our two speakers, hopefully take up about half the session with that, and then we'll turn things over to Q&A from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, you are welcome to do so. Please do so using the Q&A function on Zoom. If you're not familiar with that, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll find a Q&A button located between the green share and the show captions buttons. If you click on that Q&A button, it brings up a dialog box. You can type your question into the Q&A dialog, and I will put those to the speakers as we move along. So with that bit of introduction out of the way, let me welcome our two speakers. We, of course, have General Joseph Votel. General Votel is the only person to have served as both the Commanding General of U.S. Special Operations Command and the Commanding General of U.S. Central Command. In addition, after that remarkable start to his career, he then went on to the epitome of any U.S. military career to become a distinguished military fellow of the Middle East Institute. And General Votel is joined by Dr. Karen Young. Karen is one of my colleagues at MEI. She is a senior fellow there. She is also a professor at Columbia University, and I think she is well known to all of you as one of the leading authorities on energy and economic matters in the Middle East. General, Karen, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Good to be with
Joe,
you.
Thanks, Joe. All right, Joe, I'm going to start with you. I think we should start with the military situation. And I'm going to ask you a big question, and please take it whatever direction you want. How do you assess the military campaign so far? What are you seeing? What should we be paying attention to you?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, it's good to be with you and Karen again, and good morning to all of our listeners. I do want to just start out by noting that a little bit later today, we'll see the repatriation of our fallen soldiers back here in the United States. And so against that backdrop, I just hope everyone will keep that in mind and once again be reminded that there are real costs to war and conflict here, and we're going to see it on full display today. I'm sorry to say. So the way let me just start out. Let me talk a little bit about what I've seen from U.S. actions, what I've kind of seen from the Iranian actions, and then I'll take a moment just to talk about some things that I'm trying to pay attention to as we move forward. So, obviously there's been a lot thrown out there on what our objectives are. I think what through the two Pentagon press conferences that we've seen this week, I think we've seen some clarity in terms of what the military objectives are. So I'll just stay focused on that. In general, what the focus of the U.S. military has been is on dismantling the ability of Iran to project military power beyond its borders. And I think they're doing that through three big thrusts. First is to, paralyze the command and control of the Iranian civilian and the military security leadership. And of course, Exhibit A, of course, is the opening rounds last Saturday that, were kind of a decapitation strike, but really, function to kind of paralyze that whole system and try to affect their ability to respond while the United States and Israel, continue to, advance their military campaigns. That's the first thing. I think that's continuing to some extent, but that certainly was an important aspect in the first part of the campaign. The second big thing I think we're trying to do is destroy Iran's means of retaliation, going after ballistic missiles, going after ships, going after drone sites, going after drone carriers, and all of this architecture and system that is supported with that, I think has been a major urgency for the United States and Israel through the week, and I suspect it will be going forward, frankly. And I'll talk a little bit about how Iran's responded from that, but I think that is a key piece of it. And then I think the third big piece has been to try to use military means in our targeting to degrade their ability to control population, to disseminate messages, to orchestrate control over uprisings and other things there. We've seen over the course of the week some of the targeting expand out to the provinces where it is again trying to disrupt their ability to exercise control over it. So the big idea here is basically to really take away Iran's military capabilities, at least so they can't project them out. And those are the three ways that I think they're doing it. My expectation is that we will continue to see U.S. and Israeli targeting in these areas. I noted this morning that the president noted today will be a bad day for Iran. Heavy strikes coming. There have been heavy strikes in the last couple of days. And so I do see the U.S. campaign, especially now that a lot of the defensive capability of the Iranian armed forces has been diminished, is our ability to get in and really work hard. And I think that is what we're seeing here is kind of an acceleration of the campaign with the, in a sense of urgency, if I could say it that way, to get after their means of retaliation and to put as much pressure as we can on the regime. For their part, the Iranians, I think their response has really been to drag this out and impose costs where they can on the U.S. or on allies or supporters of the U.S. And I think they've done this in two different ways. First has been to kind of broaden their response retaliations in terms of space and geography. 12 different countries, that have been struck by something. I think their initial idea was that would cause concern in those countries. It certainly has, but I think they felt that in turn those countries would pressure on the U.S. or Israel, and I don't think that has happened to the degree that they had anticipated. So in many ways, that's failing them. I think they are also focused on trying to extend their retaliation in time. I think they are aware of how, very keenly aware of how the United States looks at lengthy operations and how our population pays attention to this. And certainly there's been a lot of discussion from our national leadership about the length of this, although most of what we're seeing is this will persist until we've accomplished our objectives. So I do think they're trying to extend this in time. Obviously, as we've seen, their ability to respond has gone down a lot. Admiral Cooper reminded us 80-90% in terms of missile and drone strikes. Nonetheless, there's 10% that is still continuing to go out. And even a week later, we're continuing to see small volleys of these munitions and missiles, and especially drones that are going out and acting in retaliation. So to me, that highlights the urgency for the U.S. to really kind of get after these means of retaliation. In many ways, I as somebody who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think about this a little bit like IEDs. We can do a lot to suppress them, but it's gonna take a major effort to remove all of those things and make sure they're all gone. I think we're going to be doing that for a little bit of time. So Iran only has to be right a couple times in terms of this, and I think they actually view at the end of this, if they're still in the remnants of the regime are still in power and are still able to do some of this stuff, then they will, I think, view this as a win. So that's kind of, Ken, what I kind of see is happening both on the U.S. and the Iranian side, and I'm sure there's a lot more to add into that, but those are kind of the big sweeps I'm thinking about. Let me just finish up by just saying some things that I'm trying to pay attention to as we move forward. First and foremost, I really do think it's critical to pay attention to how Iran is reacting to all of this. We saw the Iranian president today apologize. At the same time, they were, drones were en route to another location. Apologize for that. So, I think it's really critical to watch how the Iranians are responding to this. That will be the surest indicator that of a change in direction, either one that is communicated or one that is more subtle in terms of this. So I think that's definitely something I'm paying attention to. The tactical topic that certainly continues to come up a lot is the munitions issue, particularly from the United States standpoint, and our ability to make sure we have the right number of high-end munitions, particularly interceptors, to continue to, defend our locations, our partners' locations, and other American interests across the region. There's not a great read on what the specific status is. Obviously, the department is communicating that they have enough to do what they need to do. Certainly, there have been meetings ongoing with industry and others to make sure that munitions are going to continue to be supplied at a rapid rate for this. But this will also be something we should be paying particular attention to. I think it is highly possible that we surged a lot of munitions into the area of operations to sustain these near-term operations. I think as time goes on, there'll be more pressure put on that, and there certainly will be more pressure put on our magazine depth in other areas, our ability to respond, our ability to maintain high levels of readiness, and of course, the ability to continue to resupply our partners. I think it's important to appreciate it isn't just the United States that is shooting these interceptors. It's the UAE, it's Saudi Arabia, it's Bahrain, it's Kuwait. They all have U.S. equipment, and they're all very dependent upon those munitions. So there's a lot of pressure on this system right here, and so we have to pay really good attention to it. I think just really one last one that I'm paying some attention to, largely because of probably my special ops background, is the development of an opposition capability. There was a day or so ago some discussion about the Iranian Kurds being involved in this, and obviously I think those of us who have had the opportunity to work besides the Kurds appreciate what good fighters they are and what good soldiers and partners they make for us. That said, there's a lot involved with that. If we don't really have a clear view on what government in Iran emerges from this. They seem to be kind of following the process that is the theocratic process here, with a creation of a 3-person council and assembly of experts. That's what I think the general path is, but that hasn't been resolved. So if opposition is going to move forward, I think this is something we should pay attention to as well. Clearly, development of opposition forces isn't something that can occur in a week, especially effective opposition forces in a week. So we don't really know how long that's been underway or what amount of effort is being put into it. But there are a variety of things to think about when we talk about opposition forces. There's kind of the tactical aspect, and that's the training, the equipment, the supporting, the sustaining. When we used Syrian Kurds in the SDF, we had advisors, we provided them intelligence, we provide them surveillance, we provide them fire support. Are we prepared to do the same thing? There's a lot that's involved with that, and it isn't necessarily the capabilities that are being employed now. And then, of course, there's the strategic aspect of that. Kurds would cause some sensitivity with our Turkish allies. It would add another element to what is already a fractured opposition. We'd have to assess their ability to have an impact on a regime that, while decapitated, still the lower level instruments are still largely in place. Their ability to enforce their policies. So those are the kinds of things I'll be looking at with that. So Ken, maybe I'll stop there and then ready for questions.
So Joe, that was terrific. But before I turn things over to Karen, and as kind of a nice segue from you to Karen, I did want to ask you a little bit about the Strait of Hormuz. I know that when you were actually in both positions, this was something that you looked hard at. I know that the U.S. military has been studying this question, wargaming it, planning against how to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. I know that because I was involved in a good chunk of it. But just give us a taste of how you think that we're now approaching this issue of how we reopen the Strait.
Well, I think it definitely plays into kind of the targeting efforts that are ongoing. I think what we've seen from the U.S. is a lot of our targeting has been in the South, and I would describe that as areas down around the Straits of Hormuz, the ability for Iran to employ shore-based systems into the Straits of Hormuz and impact. So I think a lot of our targeting is going to be continue to be focused on there. A key piece, of course, has been removing the Iranian Navy, which has largely been, almost completely decimated here. There still are challenges with small boats and things like that. We haven't really heard much about the targeting of those. They are certainly vulnerable to attacks from our forces, and but still could pose a threat. I think the biggest thing I'm concerned about is the mines. I think, while we've been studying this problem for decades, Iran has been studying this problem for decades, and we don't have to be reminded that 40 years ago, we saw ships that struck single mines and pretty much brought it to a halt. So, there's what's going to have to happen is we got to be able to have suppression on this. We've got to be able to have a way of escorting ships, and we've got to have a way of making sure the area through which we are transiting is clear of mines and other hazards that could have been left there by the Iranians, and that's a big task. And of course, right now, most of our maritime forces are focused on kind of this offensive aspect of the campaign and targeting right now. So, diverting to doing that will have an impact on some of that. And then, of course, we don't have endless amounts of minesweepers and things like that. We certainly have some of those capabilities, but getting those in place will be very, very critical. And then, kind of getting the whole process in place of moving tankers back and forth through the Straits of Hormuz. Having sailed through there a couple times aboard U.S. vessels, it's pretty narrow. It's about 12 miles across. It doesn't take much. It's the advantage is to the attacker, which in this case is Iran. So it's not an insignificant tactical and operational challenge for our leaders.
Terrific. That's great, John. All right, Karen, let me bring you in. And let me start with kind of the headline of the day, right? Price of oil shot up $10 yesterday. Help us explain what's going on, and then give us again a broader sense of what's going on with energy markets and how to think about this stuff.
Sure. Well, thank you, Ken, and wonderful to be with you, General Votel. I think, the starting point is all eyes are on the Strait. And this is really what's happened in the last week. Now we're 1 week into this war. And there was, a certain amount of patience in energy markets, both for oil and gas, and sort of waiting to see, how much traffic and flows would be impeded. And through, basically by the end of the week, is a growing sense of alarm that we have a real problem. And for the reasons that General Votel just explained, we could see, problems with getting tankers through for some time, right? And we can talk about the mechanisms that the U.S. government can try to assuage some of that, but it's looking more and more that we have a volume exit problem. And so that's why you've seen the sharp price increases just over the last couple of days. Just to kind of update people, if you're not familiar how much energy products are going through this 12-mile little stretch of sea is, normally is about 15 million barrels a day of crude that goes through the Strait of Hormuz and about 4 million barrels a day of oil products. And it's the product market which is actually seeing the sharpest price increases. So that means things like diesel and airplane jet fuel. And so this is what I think we're going to see consumers really facing, kind of the sharpest sense, and governments facing the sharpest sense of inflation from those. About 20% of our global liquefied natural gas supply comes through the Strait of Hormuz, and that's exported by Qatar Energy. So we're seeing some actually sharper proportional increases in the spot price of LNG, particularly in Europe this week. So that has very, very serious implications. Iran has been exporting just about 1.5 million barrels a day through the Strait. And in the traffic, the limited kind of trickle of traffic that continues, it's Iranian tankers that are still getting through. So in our kind of effort from the U.S. side to, restrict their ability to make money and to get product to market, they are the ones who are still benefiting. And just to put some numbers around that, on March 6th, we saw 3 tankers pass through the Strait, exiting the Strait. Normal volume, February 28th, last week, was about 50 a day. So just to give you a sense of what's happening. We did have one LNG cargo load out of Qatar yesterday, and this is a little bit confusing because Qatar Energy has declared force majeure and closed down the Ras Laffan liquefaction and loading facility. And so what they are able to load is actually LNG that's in storage. So the question mark will be how much is in storage, and if that, if those tankers can actually get out. That particular one, I believe, is headed to Bangladesh. So that leads us to the problem of, what do you do with production? And what does this mean for global markets? And this is why we're seeing the prices increase so sharply. So we are filling up our storage, and for those countries that export crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz and do not have any alternatives, this means Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, because Saudi Arabia and the UAE have pipelines, and I'll talk about those. But we are seeing already significant shut-ins of oil production in Iraq, already more than 1.5 million barrels a day, and also now Kuwait. Now, what happens when an oil producer decides to shut in production? It means that you're basically now changing the ability of that production, perhaps for a long period of time. So it depends on the geology and how you restart, and you want to very safely shut down production, right? Because there's going to be gas associated in those wells along with oil, and it can be quite dangerous. So it's in some ways a precautionary kind of tactic, but it's also because there's just no place for it to go, right? And once you've kind of filled your storage capacity, then you have a real problem, and that's what we mean by shut-ins. So the pipeline capacity, so for Saudi Arabia, they have the East-West pipeline, and that pipeline can carry about 5 million barrels a day from the Eastern Province to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea corridor. It can maybe go a little bit higher. It could maybe go to 7 million barrels a day. But then there's the problem of, again, the oil transfers, it goes to the West Coast. You've got to load it onto something. You've got to put it in storage there or find a tanker who's willing to take it. And here is where we are seeing another kind of bottleneck in that Yanbu can only really load about 3 million barrels per day. So if you've got the pipeline at full capacity, you've got a problem, right? Because storage starts to fill up. You don't have enough kind of the timing to be able to get it just physically to load the fuel, the crude onto tankers. And Yanbu's been loading at about 1.9 million barrels a day the last couple of days, so not even at their full capacity. So this means that this is a limit in how much oil is going to be available to markets. There was some precautionary sending of crude to storage facilities in Asia, customers of Aramco who have received that oil, but this is going to be an ongoing issue. So the pipeline that goes to Fujairah in the UAE, avoiding the strait, is much smaller. Its capacity is about 400,000 barrels per day. And the loading in Fujairah has also been quite limited. So I think S&P is reporting that we're seeing maybe one tanker. And the issue, as I understand it, is that tankers have been a little bit reticent to enter the port of Fujairah because it has been also a target of Iranian attacks. So the kind of safety concern and the insurance concern is significant. In terms of pricing, so right now, Brent is pricing about just over $92 per barrel. If you look at Murban, which is the Dubai crude grade, that's pricing over $100 a barrel, about $103 a barrel. So we have already crossed that triple-digit threshold, and now we're in the weekend. Oil markets will open again late in Asia on Sunday night, our time. And I think many people do expect to see again this kind of leapfrogging in pricing because this sense of we're not going to solve this problem in the next 2 days, and we're probably not going to solve it in the next 2 weeks or more, is really sinking into to traders. Another interesting sort of price point to consider is that we were at $65 a barrel on February 9th. And even after the war began on Monday morning, just last week, we hit like low 80s, then kind of dropped down into the 70s. So this ramp up has been really, really rapid. We still have a lot of runway to go, I think is the assumption. The pricing, though, for tankers, right? So what you pay for the transit is what has increased so sharply. So the VLCC, these huge tankers that carry crude all over the world, their pricing is up about 200%. So we've seen a significant jump, of course, in the price of the product, but the price in the transport is what is getting so crazy. Um, and thinking just a little bit down the line and what will matter, of course, to the U.S. voters and to the U.S. president is how that translates to prices for consumers. And U.S. gasoline prices are up. They're averaging in the U.S. about $3 a barrel or a gallon. But just for some kind of comparison, this same time last year, the first week of March in 2025 was the same, right? So, like people get very worked up when gasoline and politicians get very worked up when gasoline prices start to rise. But in terms of the last year, it's actually still in a very normal kind of range. Um, I think I'll pause there and we can take questions if you want to speak more about kind of limitations for the GCC producers and the challenges that they're facing, and what this means also in terms of what U.S. interventions might be able to do anything on the military side or on the escort and insurance side.
Yeah, that's great, Karen. Absolutely terrific. And I want to ask you two follow-up questions, mostly on the US side. So just first a quick one. You made this point that, yeah, gas prices are more or less where they were a year ago. Um, it seems like the price at the pump is rising more slowly than the price per barrel. When do you expect that we'll start to see the price at the pump catch up with the price per barrel?
So the global oil market really is also about refined products, and in the US we are now importing oil from other places, including Venezuela. We have refineries that process Venezuelan crude, and of course we also have significant domestic production. So that cushions us a bit, but it is a global market, right? But refining capacity is what is more localized, and that's why I mentioned the price of diesel and the price of jet fuel, which is really important as an export product from the GCC states, that we're going to feel. So if you're planning some summer travel, and you might want to book your airline tickets right now because they're probably going to be going up. And so those prices are probably more sensitive than what we're paying for US gasoline right now.
Great. And then the other question I want to ask you, you mentioned earlier that there were some things that the US could do to try to mitigate the rise in oil prices. Why don't you spool that out? I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people, in fact, we get questions all the time about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, but what else can the US do to mitigate
Yeah.
this?
So, we do have the SPR. The administration has not so far said they're interested in relying on that. And again, that would be for U.S. consumption first and foremost. We do have the IEA, which can encourage other governments who also have strategic reserves to start putting them to market. So it could be more of an international effort. The big concern, as we started talking about, is this just tiny little strip within the Strait of Hormuz, which is really the problem. And so, if you can ameliorate some of that traffic problem, you're going to start to see prices decline. And the tension points are, as General Votel mentioned, the U.S. Navy is sort of busy right now, and they probably are not really wanting to be in the immediate business of escorting tankers. There's also then the kind of political question: whose tankers are you escorting? And where is that product going? Are we doing this as a favor to the Chinese, for example? Because 80% of the LNG that goes out of the strait is going to China, or to Asia, I should say more specifically. So it brings up some very political questions. There's also the issue of insurance. I mentioned that the tanker expenses, like what they charge, not every oil producer owns the tankers which transport its product, right? This is a whole different kind of business. And so they are charging a lot more. And so that means that insurance costs for those tankers is a lot higher. And there's some reticence to insure tankers that are also escorted by a potentially combatant in the conflict. That can be priced in, but it becomes really price prohibitive then from an insurance standpoint to do so. The other kind of things that we could do would be to create an alternative insurance facility, and that's what the administration announced yesterday. The Development Finance Corporation has begun a facility that is a $20 billion political risk insurance facility. That is probably not big enough for the demand and the need. The Development Finance Corporation does have this political risk insurance product. They've used in other places before, but they are congressionally mandated or authorized to put so much money into this portfolio. It's about $204 billion that they're authorized to do so through 2031. And they've got some money already allocated in other parts of the world for other reasons, about $50 billion. That leaves about $150 billion available to the DFC to kind of think about political risk insurance and to deploy it into this conflict. And they have decided they're going to put 20 billion. So that tells you something, right? And it's really not clear yet. This was just announced on Friday, who can use that facility and, what will be their priorities in ensuring. And there's a big difference. This is not something I'm an expert in, but I'll just say there's a difference in insurance products. What is normal maritime insurance and what is political risk insurance, right? So, we're kind of crossing boundaries there in those two product lines as well.
Outstanding. That's great, Karen. All right, let's open things up to questions. Again, if you've got a question, please feel free to ask it by writing it into the Q&A function. First, and again, as always, we get overlapping and similar questions. So I'm going to kind of take several of them that are very much along the same lines and put the first one to you, General, which is the ability of the United States to sustain these operations. And, here's some folks who are asking about more than just the munitions question, but American forces, how long can we keep two carrier battle groups out there? All the air forces, and also inevitably some questions about, does this open us up, make us vulnerable in Taiwan? What impact does this have on the Ukraine war? But see if you can take us through that as best you can, General.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I guess the first thing I just remind people is there's no free chicken here. If we dedicate resources to the Middle East, they're coming from something else. They're coming from another theater, from another mission, from another state of readiness we're trying to maintain. So, I think it's important. The big concept is when you move things into the Middle East, you move them anywhere, that's coming from someplace else. So, there is going to be an impact on this. The two carriers that are in the Middle East, waters of the Middle East right now, we're probably not projected to be in the Middle East several years ago when we kind of set up the carrier schedule. So we certainly have, as we've demonstrated multiple times, we certainly have the ability to be flexible, but that has some long-term impacts on maintenance and sustainment of those vessels and all that comes along with it. They have to go back, we are deferring maintenance and other things like that for all of these ships. So there are some impacts like that when you thinking about longer term sustainment of like our maritime forces or our air forces. There's a cost to be paid for having them deployed and being operationally engaged, and that's often deferred, but at some point it comes due. That we won't see that play out in the next few weeks or months likely, but it will play out at some particular point. There will be a cost with all of that. The U.S. Navy routinely replaces carrier strike groups in different parts of the world. So, there could be another one that could be alerted, being ready to come and replace one of the carrier strike groups, or, that's been in place for a while, so that it can go back and, reset and move on for its next mission. In terms of, air power, we do still have a lot of air assets outside of the theater that can be rotated in and replaced in. So I guess the picture I'm painting to you is, I think with general forces, we have the ability to replace them, to sustain it for some period of time, well into the months. There's a cost with all of that. We have to, excuse me, we have to recognize that. So we'll have to do that. I think the bigger issue again is going to kind of come down to munitions, kind of the patience of the American people in terms of how long we are engaged in this. Those are kind of certainly the patience aspect, and the support of the American people is one that is is a little bit intangible in terms of also that has to be maintained as well. From a military standpoint, we have the ability to bring more in. We have the ability to rotate people. We have to recognize there's deferred costs on that. We should be paying attention to some of the other things like we've already talked about, munitions that can have an impact, and we should be thinking about what this means in terms of the other things that we have going on out there, whether it's support to the Ukraine situation or other contingencies that we're worried about. There's going to be costs in terms of all of that as well.
Great. And Karen, so there's also a few questions that are actually a nice segue, and it's a little bit unfair. I'll ask you the question, but then I'll also give you a way to maybe ask it to answer it if you don't want to take on exactly what's being. So the questions that are being asked are about the potential domestic political impact of the higher oil prices, exactly the way General Votel is pointing out, that this is one of the costs that the American public is likely to bear, and how this is going to have an impact on the midterm elections, and did the Trump administration think this through? If you'd like to tackle that, you are welcome to do so. If not, because obviously you're not an expert in domestic American politics, maybe just talk through the different ways that higher oil prices have historically in the past affected U.S. domestic politics.
Yeah, you stuck me with the tough one, Ken. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, to put this into perspective, gasoline prices are where they were a year ago, right? Like, this is not a really, truly a heavy burden to the U.S. consumer, the U.S. voter right now. There are much heavier costs being paid, certainly in the region, and among our soldiers. There's just there's a bigger picture out there, right? But yeah, it can get worse. This can certainly contribute to inflationary pressure. We're seeing downward kind of growth, provisions or outlooks globally. This is going to hit other countries harder first, and not just those that are dependent on the region for oil. This is where the LNG story becomes really important. So I would say, the timing of the decision to start this conflict, because we did start it, arguably had it been going on. This is something that we're living with really over the last 2.5 years, and many administrations have struggled with how to confront Iran. This isn't new, but in the last week it has escalated very quickly, and we should be prepared that this is going to have a long-term effect on the global economy, on certainly energy markets, and be disruptive for some time to come. It's not a supply problem, right? Like, we have very well supplied global oil markets. It's a transit delivery problem. We also have plenty of gas, but it's a transit delivery problem from one source. So looking forward, 5 years from now, how will governments and planners think about their energy security? Diversification is going to be like the key priority. Diversity of sources of your fossil fuel supply, but also diversification in terms of renewable energy and what you can make at home. So, this is already part of our national politics. It will become more so. And I think many other countries are now feeling that pressure. So if we can get into a little bit on the gas side, I think this matters a lot. And this is where I think our kind of the geopolitics of the impact on energy markets is going to be really important. So what we're seeing, because of Qatar's, very strong position within kind of global LNG supply, is this is hitting countries in Asia first very sharply. So in South Korea and Taiwan, in Japan, also in China, you're seeing these governments have to react, basically saying, we're not going to send out any refined fuel, like we're not going to export anything we might have also shared with neighbors. We're going to keep it at home. And we're going to think about diversifying our supply. The pricing increase that we saw in LNG first really hit European spot markets earlier in the week. And so Europe has already been under pressure because of the lack of supply from Russia. We still have some LNG being delivered to Europe from Russia, but basically pipeline gas has stopped. And the Russians are clearly probably enjoying this moment. And the US government, just in the last 48 hours, agreed to relax some sanctions enforcement against Russian crude exports to India, to one country in particular, to allay the Indian government's fear that they would not have sufficient crude supply. So Russia is really winning. In terms of their ability to stay in the market, to even get some sanctions relief from the US government, and to squeeze Europe more tightly, right? To threaten Europe more tightly on gas. I think that is probably the takeaway. When we think about impact to the US consumer, think about our friends in Europe and in East Asia before us, because they're going to feel this, I think, economically and in ways, geopolitically before we will.
Interesting. General, got a really interesting question. I like it because I want to take advantage of your special forces background. And the question is basically, if you were going to try to set up an unconventional warfare approach toward putting pressure on this regime, the Iranian regime, or whatever it is that the Trump administration is hoping to accomplish with it, how would you go about it? How long would it take? How long would it take to start to have an impact on the regime? You're
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I think there's a few things that have to be identified up front. First of all, we have to identify who that force is that we are going to work with, and that sometimes takes some efforts. When we, not necessarily an unconventional approach here, but when we made the decision to work with the Syrian Democratic Forces, for example, I mean that was actually a debate in the national security process about, was this the partner in terms of that. So we have to identify who that partner is and make an assessment of their ability to help achieve the objectives that we are aimed at. And so that's kind of the first piece of this. The second piece is, once identified, then you've got to do things like train, equip, and get that force ready to go. And usually that takes place at in sanctuary, someplace where you can afford to assemble people. You can train them, you can work with them, you can get them ready, you can use as a mechanism to deploy them into the area of operations. So you've got to have something like that. Then, third, you've got to have a force that can work with that unconventional capability. U.S. Special Forces, Green Berets. This is one of the principal reasons why we have organizations like this. They're experts at unconventional warfare and raising these types of forces. So you have to have somebody do that. Our intelligence community helps with this as well. They have some exquisite capabilities in terms of developing this, whether we try to do it under, depending upon the authorities under which we do something like this. So you got to have people dedicated to actually working with them. I think, then I think, bringing them into the area of operations, as I mentioned briefly a little bit ago, we've got to wrestle with what level of support are we going to provide them? Are we going to enable them, or are they on their own? And I think in most cases, what we've seen is that there's certainly going to be some level of enablement for them, whether that is advice, whether it's intelligence, whether it's surveillance capability, whether it's fire support, whether it's resupply, whether it's evacuation of their casualties. We have to think through all of those kinds of things that'll be necessary for it. And then we have to think about what it is we want them to achieve. If an unconventional force is just going into, to do raids and to disrupt, the regime, and kind of help contribute to some of our military objectives, that's a different problem set than a opposition force that is going to go in and take over the government. And in this, I have to remind people that this isn't this stops becoming just a military problem. This becomes a political problem. So we have to bring all of our other elements of of national power into this to make sure that we have identified, who is going to step in and be the leader. How is that government going to function? How are we going to support them? So it really depends on what specific objectives we have for an opposition force and what we want them to do. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to be done. And in most cases, this is months to years of work. What would be great is if we had a very steady effort over the course of several years to develop opposition forces, to take advantage of a moment like we saw in December and January of this year. I mean, I think that the assessment is, while there is opposition capability on the ground, no doubt about it, and serious opposition, the regime responded very dramatically to it. But it is not coherent, and it's not unified enough to actually overthrow what is pretty much an entrenched regime that's in place right now. So, we have to think through what those objectives are. And again, these are not things. We're not going to create an opposition force in a week, and we're not just going to do it by encouraging someone to do it, at least effectively. So it takes time. It takes months to years to do this effectively.
That's great, Joe. Okay, one for you, Karen. Another interesting one. Just a little bit, but I think it's good to ask it to you flat out, which is what are the 2 or 3 key factors you're going to be focused on regarding longer term energy price stability for the rest of 2026?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's, again, this theme of energy security. It's going to be about, if we see any kind of resolution to, opening the strait as quickly as possible, what lingering reputational risk, and sense of political risk lingers for the Gulf oil and gas producers. Does this change some sort of long-term contracting and the pricing of their product relative to others? Does it change the investment landscape? And certainly, the local economies of the GCC, how are they going to be able to recover? So those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about. So it's a bit of intertwined, both kind of the region's economy, global energy markets, and how governments are going to think about energy diversification and energy security. So I think there will be huge ramifications from this crisis. We're just at the beginning of it, though. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to keep kind of looking 1 week ahead, 2 weeks ahead. It's as I said, I think this week, towards the end of the week, it started to sink in markets just how serious the problem is. So if we get shut-ins of 9 million barrels a day of Gulf production within the next couple of, a week or two, that's, going to inch towards more than 10% of the global supply of oil. Like, that has obvious price impacts, but it starts to really get difficult for the producer economies, but for all of us. And so, put that in the context of not just, an active war that is expanding geographically, towards the Eastern Med, towards South Asia, but also in terms of the ways that our economies are linked together. So 2 or 3 factors, I think every day I'm like adding 3 more. So it's like 10 factors a day. It's getting very complex and very, very risky. Yeah.
Outstanding. All right, General, back to you. A whole bunch of questions about Chinese and Russian support to Iran. Obviously, there was the report, I think it was in the Journal, maybe I'm wrong, maybe it was the Post, making the point that, surprise, surprise, the Russians are providing all kinds of targeting data and other information to the Iranians. How significant do you think Chinese and Russian support to the Iranians is? Could it have a real impact on the course of this war?
I think we have to take serious the fact that Russia is providing intelligence to Iran. I mean, that directly goes after protection of our forces and could have an impact on our operations. I don't know that it necessarily has, but nonetheless, it's a serious concern. It's not completely unexpected. Certainly they might view this as payback for our support to Ukraine or something like that. But nonetheless, it is it is of significant concern, and we should be paying attention to that, and we should be paying attention to what more Russia is doing. This shouldn't be lost on anybody that the major producer of drones for Russia has been Iran for the last couple of years to support their operations. So there is a deep military exchange between these countries, and certainly that could be used against us, and we need to be paying attention to that. There's not necessarily a lot the military can do about that, but certainly our diplomatic corps, our political apparatus ought to be focusing on sending very, very clear messages to the Russians about what we're doing and about what we don't want them to do. China, I think, is a little bit different. China does have a relationship with obviously with Iran. I think they view them, my view, a little bit more as a client, as a market, so to speak, and they're dependent upon maybe some resources coming out of there, and a little bit of an alignment with that. I don't necessarily anticipate that they would be providing a lot of overt capability and stuff to the Iranians. I don't think that's what they're going to see. I think largely what we're going to see is potentially some political support from them, some information support from them, and then of course, whatever they need to do to kind of preserve their markets. But I think I think bigger piece for China is that China is looking at this and looking at the United States potentially tied down here. Now we are clearly messaging that this is not a long-term engagement, but yet it is. We are expending munitions. We are expending readiness. We're doing all kinds of things here. So this, and it's another way we have taken our eye off of the Asia Pacific, which is, I think, indicative. It allows China a little bit more of a free hand. Of course, they're looking at our operations, not just this one, but Venezuela as potential models for things that they do. So I think those are some things that may impact China down the line with this. But no doubt they're players here to some extent, and we should be paying attention to that.
Perfect. Okay, Karen, over to you. Again, interesting question, and again, a little bit unfair, but would love to hear your speculation on it, which is long-term economic restructuring, reform in the Gulf, right? We've seen all of the Gulf countries over the last 5, 10 years, some cases longer, trying to develop different economic models. How might the war affect the region's economies over the long term? Could it affect those reform programs? Could we see them decide to move in different directions as a result of the war and the impact on energy? Play it out a little bit in terms of the long term.
So I think, again, it kind of goes back to our open question of, what is the duration of this conflict? Does Iran have the capacity to continue low-level violence and harassment, not just of tankers, but of civilian infrastructure in the Gulf? And that is a very, very big problem and obstacle to, these cities as international hubs for finance, of sites of tourism, and as centers for multinational businesses. So it is in direct conflict with the aspirations of the GCC states for how they want to be middle powers in a very different global economy, their relationship with China as a co-investor, all of the aspirations, including their own energy mix and transition. So it's tough. Like, this is the greatest threat. It's really existential that the Gulf states are facing, and governments are, I think, throwing everything at it in terms of trying to defend their populations, which are very mixed, right? These are countries where, in the case of Qatar and the UAE, 10% of the population are nationals or citizens. 90% are people from other places. So keeping that model alive and being an attractive place where people want to come and contribute their human capital comes into question. There's a lot been written in the last week kind of criticizing the Dubai model and, making fun of people who are trying to exit. And people who live in the UAE in particular are saying, no, we're going to stay. We're part of it. The government's, really taking care of us. So it creates a sense of national pride for many people, citizens and non, but also obviously is creating a huge, huge risk and a rethink for particularly in I think the financial service sector, how dominant they want to be as a base and a hub there. This also brings into question, some of the recent shared investments in technology and AI in the Gulf, which the U.S. and U.S. technology companies have been very engaged in. Is this a safe place to do so? Does it make business sense? It makes business sense from a connectivity standpoint, a geographical standpoint, but now we've had data centers targeted in both the UAE and Bahrain. I don't think anybody really expected that, except Sam Winter-Levy at is he Carnegie or Brookings? I don't remember, but he has written about that. So it is interesting, and so I think if this is resolved or we see some kind of shift in the Iranian approach, whether that's a commitment not to attack the GCC states or some change in government, the way that President Trump has suggested, that is more amenable to the US demands, then yeah, things probably settle down pretty quickly and the regional economy resumes, right, as normal. But this, if it lasts much, much longer, if we see continued attacks on civilian infrastructure, particularly to the airports issue, I think is really what is scaring a lot of people. When you can't leave and you can't get your family out, that has a real kind of lasting imprint on people's perception of risk. And people from different places, people who are in the Gulf because they're fleeing conflict from other areas, maybe have a higher risk tolerance. But I think for certainly many American families and European families, this is going to be a tough thing to recover from.
Terrific. Okay, and Joe, I got, sorry, General, last one for you. And it's a tough one, and I've been saving it to the end, but you got 2 minutes to give some kind of an answer, which is, there was a leak that the intelligence community submitted an estimate indicating that it felt it was unlikely that this would result in the collapse of the Iranian regime. Any thoughts on the likelihood that this kind of an air campaign can bring about the fall of the Islamic Republic?
Well, I don't want to take anything away from our brave pilots and air crews and others that are doing good work, as well as the Navy and the Army who are defending all of our bases. I think they're doing very, very good. But I think when we look at a mission like regime change, I think we have to recognize that there's things that the military can do to certainly contribute to it, to kind of help set some of the conditions. But ultimately, the change in regime is a political objective, and so there has to be something from the political side that is going to kind of see this through. We've had a lengthy discussion about opposition forces and opposition leadership and things like that. So all that has to take place. The military can't do that. I don't believe. I think they can do a lot. We can set a lot of conditions, but and we can certainly through our the use of our munitions and expert targeting and other things put a lot of pressure and cause changes in behaviors that may help lead to changes in regime. But I think ultimately there's more that has to be applied here. I see three potential outcomes here, and I'll list them in the order in which I think they're going to happen. One, I think the first is that there is a next regime comes in, a theocratic regime comes in. That's the process that's in place. That's kind of the steps that they've taken so far, and it's likely that that's what they will continue on, short of something else. The second option would be to have some leader in the military, whether it's the IRGC Quds Force or the IRGC or the broader military, step forward and take control, take it away from them. That's plausible because they do control a lot of the instruments that the regime relies on for keeping order and keeping themselves in control. That could happen as well. I'm not sure we've seen any particular indications of that, but that certainly is a plausible option. And then the third would be the rise of an opposition force. And while not impossible, at this point, I think it's improbable that the population would rise up to such extent that they'd be able to take control of the instruments of the government and then effectively move it forward. I just don't think we're there with that. We've had a discussion about kind of what that what that takes, but there could be some elements of that. What I fear, however, is that this will kind of linger on, and we could be caught in between a couple of these here as time moves on. So that's kind of how I see it. I think we're likely to see something that is theocratic. I think there's also a good chance there would be something security led, and then we have to consider the role of opposition forces in this.
That was terrific. General Karen, outstanding. Thank you both so much. Your insights are always so helpful to all of us. I really am so appreciative. I will certainly be inviting you back, and hopefully you will accept those invitations at different points in time. Thank you both so much. And for everybody out there, we're going to be doing another one of our virtual briefings Monday morning at 11 a.m. Look forward to seeing you all then. Until then, enjoy the rest of your weekend.